Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. This is our last public program of the quarter, and we are pleased to welcome Randall Schriver, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. It is a special treat for me. We both were graduate students at Stanford many years ago together, and he's even more insightful and definitely more plugged in than he was then. We are looking forward to his conversation with NBC's Courtney Kube. I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow at lunch, we will be hosting a few recent IOP alumni for a students-only conversation about their work on the campaign trail in 2018. You can find out more about this and other upcoming events, and stay tuned for our upcoming events for our winter quarter, which will begin programming again in January. You can look on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will open up the floor for questions after the conversations. The mic will be in the center aisle. As usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to students. We remind you that questions end in a question mark. We ask you to put your phones on silent. And here to formally introduce our speakers is Miles Ogihara. Miles is a first-year student from Croton-on-Hudson, New York, studying political science. He is currently a researcher at the Paul Douglas Institute, a member of the College Republicans, and a writer for the GATE, which is the IOP's undergraduate political review. Please join me in welcoming Miles to the podium.
Hello and good evening. In the past, the United States has enjoyed unparalleled influence, leadership, military superiority, and prosperity on the international stage. Now, however, America faces an increasingly complex strategic environment. As the recent Department of Defense 2018 National Defense Strategy states, quote, "The central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition." Here today to discuss this changing security environment, explain the Trump administration's foreign policy approach in the Indo-Pacific region, and much more, is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs, Randall Schriver. Even before being appointed by President Trump at the start of 2018, Mr. Schriver had extensive background in international security and affairs. A graduate of Williams College and Harvard University, Mr. Schriver began his career as a naval intelligence officer before becoming a special assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an attaché to the U.S. embassies in Beijing and Ulaanbaatar. Following this, he worked at the Department of Defense and then was Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State before becoming the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Now, after some time in the private sector as a founding member of an international business and strategy consulting firm, Assistant Secretary Schriver plays a critical role for the United States as a leader in the Defense Department strategy for Asian affairs. As a decorated military serviceman, awarded public servant, and highly esteemed security expert, we are honored to have Mr. Schriver with us. Today's conversation will be moderated by Courtney Kube, the national security and military reporter for NBC News. She previously served as a national security producer and the Pentagon producer, also with NBC. So without further ado, I present to you Courtney Kube and Assistant Secretary of Defense, Randall Schriver. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have to say this is by far the most beautiful setting I have ever been in for a panel like this. So I'm really thrilled to be here and very honored to be here with Assistant Secretary Schriver. And let's just get started. You have a very complicated job right now. You have 3 very difficult threats in your region: the threat from North Korea, the threat from China, and of course the threat from terrorism in Southeast Asia. So let's start there. On North Korea, when you came into this job about a year ago, there was a very real concern that the US and South Korea were headed towards conflict with North Korea. And there's been a dramatic sea change in that time. The relationship between North Korea and the United States, which didn't exist, is now working in the diplomatic realm. And it seems that tensions have gone down quite a bit since that time. And that's due in part to your role in helping to set up the Singapore summit, one of the people who helped to organize it and put it together. Can you talk to us about that? And what was it like in these negotiations to set up that summit? What were the things, the issues that became, where the two sides had a hard time coming together on? What was the stress like, knowing that you were setting up this summit and the implications for it?
Right. Well, thank you, Ms. Cuvée, and thank you to the Institute of Politics. Really happy to be here, my first visit to University of Chicago. So I had a great day today and looking forward to this conversation. You're absolutely correct. The atmosphere was quite different when I swore into office in January 2018. And I think the types of things we did in 2017 before my arrival in early 2018 actually made the Singapore summit possible. I think putting pressure on the regime in North Korea, not only the military aspects of that, but enforcing the sanctions, what was referred to as maximum pressure, helped bring Kim Jong-un to a place where he was willing to talk, first in a inter-Korea summit and then ultimately in Singapore with President Trump. The issues are not new issues. We've been pursuing denuclearization a long time, 4-party talks, 6-party talks. So we knew very clearly what we were seeking as we sat down in Panmunjom and negotiated the summit statement. The North Koreans themselves had longstanding issues that they were seeking. They, of course, want some relief from the economic pressure. They want some vision of the future where there's less pressure on them from the alliance. And so, in a way, we were picking up where previous negotiators had left off, but the big difference being we were going right to summitry. We have a president, some would say unconventional, but certainly willing to do bold and different things. And I would say meeting with Kim Jong-un was a bold move. So we had the opportunity to say, look, this is a very significant development. This is an opportunity for North Korea to get on a different path. This is an opportunity for a much brighter future. The one thing we are very focused on is denuclearization. And so we got the statement that ultimately ended up in the joint statement. Some maybe said we could have had stronger language or stronger commitment. The key was to set up the two leaders to even have that conversation and have a foundation of a commitment to work forward from. I would also add we got the commitment on POW MIA affairs, which has turned out to be, I think, very significant for the families who have missing loved ones from the Korean conflict. We still have many outstanding cases, so the fact that that cooperation has resumed is very gratifying for us at the department, but something that the president took on personally and continues to have an interest in. So we're hoping for more progress, but I think that Singapore summit was a necessary step in order to even position us for possible success, and that's where we are.
So in that time, it's been about 6 months since the summit, North Korea has continued to enrich uranium. There's some reports that they're continuing their ballistic missile program. You mentioned the deal or the joint communique that came out after the summit, but it didn't really talk about a lot of specifics about how the denuclearization of the peninsula would come about. The continued uranium enrichment and the ballistic missile program, as far as you understand, is that a violation of any agreement? If North Korea continues on the path with both of those programs, is that violating any agreement that President Trump and Kim Jong-un came to?
Well, let me say, first of all, what we were doing prior to Singapore was unprecedented and different. A lot of people wanted to compare the Singapore statement with the Leap Day Agreement or previous agreements from the 6-party talks. We were not involved in technical discussions on denuclearization. We were producing a statement for leaders at a summit meeting. And so we always knew it would be sort of the less specific, less technical. What we really wanted to do was get a commitment on the table. And I think Kim Jong-un himself has now publicly committed to the final full verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. We knew that process would be a process that would take some time and take probably several or many iterations of contacts and discussions and negotiations. Our State Department is in the lead on that. We now have a special envoy, Mr. Began, who's responsible for that, and so we at the Department of Defense are supporting our diplomats in that effort. I don't think we're at a point where we'd say there's broken commitments. I think we have a commitment, and it's important now that North Korea fulfill their obligations.
What about, there was some talk early on about North Korea, a hope that North Korea would disclose all of their facilities, which hasn't happened yet at any of the meetings. And Vice President Pence, in an interview a couple of weeks ago, kind of cast some doubt on whether that was even going to happen in the next iteration of these meetings. Do you think that's an important step for them to disclose all of their locations where they're enriching uranium, where their programs are, and if in fact they don't disclose all of them, is that a sign that the U.S. can't trust them going forward in the negotiations, that they aren't going to be transparent?
So end goal we want is the final full verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. The experiences that we've had in working on denuclearization in other scenarios, other countries, some declaration has been involved in the past and we think would be necessary in the process here. There are a lot of things we could do in the interim to build trust and build confidence and show good faith. I'll leave it to the State Department and others to say what we think we need for the next round of negotiations. But clearly at some point a declaration needs to be part of it, and that will be a means by which we can judge their seriousness and, in fact, their intent.
You've spoken in the past about a binary trap, which is, you've explained as, there's an idea that the U.S. either needs to accept North Korea as a nuclear power or go to war, or there will be a conflict. And you have said in the past that there needs to be more of a spectrum on that. Where would you say the U.S. is right now on that spectrum? Is it leaning more towards accepting North Korea eventually as, in some capacity, as a nuclear power?
I think you're referring to what I said in testimony on Capitol Hill, and I said we want to avoid a binary trap where the decision is only war or nuclear armed North Korea. The spectrum in between involves diplomacy, and that's where we are. So we've started a diplomatic process. We started at the very highest level, and I think for many reasons that's helpful when you deal with North Korea. There's only really one person over there whose decision-making matters. He's made a commitment, and now we're involved in the diplomatic process to try to see that that's fulfilled.
You also mentioned the sanctions on South North Korea, some of them including from the United Nations. There have been more and more reports that they've been evading these sanctions and these ship-to-ship transfers at sea, and that has continued even since the United Nations met in September. Does there need to be more enforcement of that? Is there enforcement that's going on that we just don't know about? And how does that play into this idea of a maximum pressure campaign if they're still going forward and illegally transferring goods against the sanctions?
So they are attempting to evade sanctions through what's referred to as ship-to-ship transfer. That's primarily coal coming out from one ship being transferred to another in order to sell it in the marketplace somewhere, and petroleum going in. Same process of ship-to-ship and back to North Korea. So we're involved in an effort along with other like-minded countries to disrupt that, curtail that. Japan's playing a very helpful role as a host to aviation assets, ships that are participating in that activity, also being able to make port calls in Japan. But we have many countries involved in that: Australia, New Zealand, even countries that might not come to mind initially as Asia-Pacific powers. We have the UK, we have France contributing ships to that effort. It's a sustained effort, but I would tell you the North Koreans are learning, evolving, getting better, so the ship-to-ship transfers are taking place further away from the peninsula. So they're getting better with their own attempts to evade, and we're evolving as well in terms of our sustained effort to disrupt that. I'm pretty confident that we are not going to let up, that the economic pressure will continue until we see the concrete steps that we need to see on denuclearization. So as North Korea evolves and gets better with these ship-to-ship transfers, we'll do so as well, and we'll keep the pressure on.
Will you evolve by sending in more assets, more ships, more surveillance and could it lead to boarding the North Korean ships and
so that's been the trend, is more assets. We started with surges, and now we're at a higher level, but a sustained level. I can't speak to whether or not there would be boardings, and if so, would it be permissive or non-permissive boardings. That, frankly, hasn't been necessary to date. What we call hail inquiries, just querying the ship, seems to be enough for them to stop the activity. What's equally as powerful as boarding a ship is taking a picture of the hull, getting information about the ship involved in the illegal activity, and that allows you to get to the insurers, the networks, the people financing the operation. And so we've been successful with a camera as much as we would be if we were to proceed to boardings.
So the naming and the shaming as opposed to the boardings.
Naming and shaming and actually cutting off support. So if they can't get insured, they're not likely to go onto the high seas.
I want to ask you also about South Korea. The Secretary Mattis said recently that Full Eagle, which is a big annual exercise that takes place in the spring, that it's going to be scaled back at this point for next year. At what point, so this is now several cycles of exercises that have been scaled back between the U.S. and South Korea. As a reporter, I've listened to years to how important these exercises are for interoperability with partner nations, specifically with South Korea. At what point are you concerned that this will have a degradation of readiness of the U.S. and potentially interoperability? How many cycles of exercises can this go on for?
Well, on the specific question of readiness, we look to our military joint staff, our U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and our U.S. Forces Korea to give an assessment of that. I've seen, for example, General Abrams in his own confirmation hearing did acknowledge that there could be some degradation if this were to continue over time. But remember, this is linked to North Korea negotiating in good faith and progress in our negotiations. So I would call this a good problem to have if we have to make these decisions in the future. Everything that's been announced is what we've decided. No other decisions have been made about future activities. If we do find ourselves in such a case, there are ways to mitigate, doing exercises off the peninsula, changing the scale and scope of the exercise, and we'll take a look at all of that if we have to.
Could you see in the future, assuming that North Korea continues to negotiate in good faith, could you see exercises like that just happening in Hawaii and bringing the Koreans to a U.S. property? Or?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate too much on what we might do. Again, if they're negotiating in good faith, we'd consider that a good problem to have, and we can adapt. But there are a number of things we can do to mitigate potential loss to readiness.
I'd like to shift a little bit to China. China remains North Korea's largest trading partner. Are they doing enough to influence North Korea to denuclearize the peninsula? Can they be doing more, China?
I think they can. Our president and other senior leaders have suggested that China is doing some helpful things, but not to the full extent we'd like to see them put pressure on North Korea. I think this isn't necessarily things going across the border, trading of goods and things and people, but maybe some of the front companies and financial activities. So we could see more help from China if they were of the mind to do so, and we're certainly engaged with the Chinese on that. We hosted the Minister of Defense from China at the Pentagon about a month and a half ago, and this was certainly a topic. And at least rhetorically, we agree on the need to enforce sanctions, so we'll keep at it with the Chinese. Was
there anything else that the military leaders from the U.S. asked the Chinese to do besides that you can talk about here in public forum?
Oh, we had a very full, robust discussion across a range of issues. Our secretary is very focused on risk reduction and confidence building with the Chinese. He understands that the Chinese are a growing military power, and as such, we will come into closer proximity with one another on a more frequent basis, and therefore we need to make sure the operating environment remains safe. We don't want an accident or unintended incident to result in something catastrophic that no one wants or had planned for. We've seen something like that in the past. In April 2001, the EP3 incident, which led to a major political crisis and a downward spiral in the relationship. We intend to continue to fly, sail, operate where international law allows, but we want to do that in a way that's safe and doesn't provoke an unintended crisis.
Secretary Mattis has spoken about the need to work with China in some ways, even if it means stepping on one another's toes. How do you see the U.S. can work with China more to help build some kind of a relationship that might in some way help avoid unintended consequences, some kind of an accidental, misguided clash?
Sure. Well, we do have some mechanisms, and in many cases it's just implementing what we've already agreed to. So in 1998, we signed something called the Maritime Consultative Agreement, Mmca. It's an incidents at sea-like agreement. And it's really to get operators speaking to operators about safety protocols, rules of the road, and there's things that they can do to exercise that bridge-to-bridge communications when we're in proximity with one another. Annual meetings to talk about potential problems. We have hotlines. We have a number of things that can be exercised. Historically, the problem has been when we actually have a problem, those break down. EP3 being a great example of that, where the United States side wanted to invoke the Mmca, the Chinese side saying that they wanted to cancel the Mmca, which was a, I think, counterintuitive, counterproductive response. We saw it in the accidental bombing of the embassy in Belgrade in 1999, where we tried to use the hotline and there was no answer on the other end. So what I think we're really focused on is making the existing confidence-building measures meaningful, exercising them, practicing them, and developing better habits of cooperation. If there's need for further measures or modalities, we'll work on that as well. That conversation has also started.
The National Defense Strategy, which we hear a lot about at the Pentagon, has identified China as a long-term strategic competitor of the United States. How is the U.S. right now well positioned to compete or to win that competition? And if not, what areas do you see a need for, particularly the Department of Defense, the U.S. military, to focus more on?
Well, I think it's also spelled out in our National Defense Strategy what we do about it. So, you know, identifying China as a strategic competitor is talking about the landscape. What we do about it, you'll find in the 3 pillars of the National Defense Strategy. So, increasing the lethality of the force. I mean, we've been training, equipping, preparing for different kind of warfare for decades now, and so thinking about potential contingencies with a peer competitor is an entirely different endeavor. So preparing our force for that and increasing the lethality of the force. Pillar 2, working with partners and allies. You know, we're a Pacific country, but we're not a resident Asia-Pacific country. Even as far as the Aleutian Islands stretch and Guam, we're still not fully resident in Asia. So we're highly dependent on partners and allies. We have 5 treaty allies in Asia, some of which we have forward deployed forces in. But we also have a number of important emerging partners who want more of a relationship with the United States military and are interested in permitting access and growing that relationship. So we're building out sort of more diverse options for our forward activities, and that requires a lot of investment from our office. That's what we do in terms of working with our counterparts and our interlocutors in all these countries. So there's a number of things that we're doing which are spelled out in the National Defense Strategy that help us with that landscape issue of China growing as a strategic competitor. What
about just the basic way that China looks at an issue, though? I mean, they really play the long game. They look at issues as generationally, you know, the 100-year. Does the U.S. military specifically need to start planning longer term like that, or looking at bigger issues like, you know, cyber and artificial intelligence? Are there areas that deficits, specific areas that you think the U.S. needs to pay more attention to?
No question. And I think the Chinese are not 10 feet tall, but there are certain things they do well. They do have the ability to strategize and think long term in a way that's very disciplined. It's harder for a messy democracy like ours. But we do need to think about being positioned for long-term strategic competition, which in a way is key to keeping the peace. It's not that we want to fight or a problem with China. In order to keep the peace, I think we need to be well positioned for that competition. So some of the areas you mentioned, you know, maybe some of these non-traditional military and security areas are places we do need to invest. You've followed the discussion about a space force, I'm sure, very closely from your work in the Pentagon. So we're obviously spending a lot of time on that. We have a recent cyber strategy report. So these are all things that are being worked on. We need to sort of take all that and make it into a more cohesive, coherent approach to competing effectively with China, and that's what we're working on.
You mentioned the freedom of navigation operations, the FONOPs. Those have increased in the last year or so. In 2018, there were more than previous years. How is it that the U.S. does not see that as a potential act of provocation? We hear about the potential for a miscalculation between the United States and China. Doesn't this open up the possibility when the U.S. sails a ship close to one of these man-made islands in the South China Sea, doesn't it open up the possibility for some kind of a miscalculation by a Chinese military leader that could lead to catastrophe?
Well, we have choices, right? So we can either cede international space, international law to a country that has an expansive illegitimate claim, or we can operate in these areas where international law allows. I think if you look at freedom of navigation operations, it's a global program, so we do this all over the world, and we do it in a routine fashion, and we do it in ways that are, we think, mitigating against the risk of a miscalculation or an accident. In many cases, we've been public about it. We've had reporters participate in some of those. I don't know if you've had a chance to do that. But our intention is to be transparent. This is where international law allows us to operate, and we're doing so in a way to really uphold values, principles, norms that are widely shared. And I think there are some countries in Asia who don't want to speak publicly about supporting that, but I can tell you privately there's a lot of support for the work we're doing to uphold international law in the South China Sea and beyond.
Do you have any way of measuring whether it's actually having an impact, though? I mean, the Chinese have been building up these islands for several years now, and they just really continue to be building them, and now they're militarizing them, some of them putting jets, potentially anti-ship missiles and whatnot. Are the FONOPs actually having an impact?
Well, I think in terms of the buildup on the outpost that you mentioned, the Chinese have succeeded to some extent at militarization of the outposts, and we've not only acknowledged that, but we've imposed costs. We disinvited them from the Rim of the Pacific exercise being one example of that. But the real key is, are these outposts significant in peacetime in an effort to enforce, again, an illegitimate, expansive sovereignty claim? As long as we operate the way we do, as long as we're joined by others, by the way, many other countries are involved in presence operations and joint patrols, then in fact those outposts aren't significant in peacetime in terms of what the Chinese goal really is. So what they've done is spent a lot of money, destroyed the surrounding environment. I mean, that's one of the most underappreciated stories about this is the destruction of coral reef and environmental degradation that this work has led to. But in our view, to no effect when it comes to their ultimate goal of enforcing this sovereignty claim. If we let up and are complacent, then there is the possibility of an erosion of what is now international water, and we don't want that to happen. We don't want any single country to be able to change international law or international norms.
But it may not be as big of a concern right now at peacetime, but if there were to be a war footing, then they would have these outposts that put them within such a close range of so many strategic U.S. allies with their aircraft. I mean, it really gives them a tactical and strategic advantage just to have that land. And it doesn't seem like there's any indications they're giving it up anytime soon.
I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I would offer that those outposts are very isolated, very difficult to defend, and pretty well constructed for our military capabilities to deal with if it were an actual conflict. So to me, the question is, will these outposts be significant in peacetime and in pursuit of a sovereignty claim? And that's why I think the sustained work on freedom of navigation operations, presence operations is so important.
Okay. I want to shift to Afghanistan and Pakistan a little bit. The U.S. and the coalition, NATO coalition, are putting a lot of pressure on the Taliban right now with the hopes of bringing them to the negotiating table. This is part of the South Asia strategy, which was introduced in August of 2017, and the idea is pressuring the Taliban and forcing them to a negotiated settlement. But President Trump has just recently cast some doubt on the idea that these talks will actually even yield any kind of an agreement or even succeed. What happens if these peace negotiations, the talks with the Taliban, fail? What's the next step? Is there a next step?
Well, I prefer to talk about where we are in terms of the opportunity. We have changed our military posture and our strategy. We have named a special envoy who's very experienced. I'm sure you've met Pastor Khalizad. We are working with both the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan to identify authoritative, competent negotiating teams. And we're trying to, as a interested and involved party, but not a direct participant, involve ourselves in a process that will bring about peace talks. We've been in a conflict for 17 years. That's too long. It's too costly. We do want to see this war come to an end, and we want to see this come to an end in a way that is beneficial for the people of Afghanistan who've suffered too long. So the only reasonable route to getting there is through a diplomatic process. We've had a military stalemate. The Taliban cannot achieve their goals on the battlefield. They have to come to the negotiating table. So we want to promote that, and the military is involved in supporting our diplomats, and our military pressure is designed to empower our diplomats.
There does seem to be a new urgency about it, certainly more so than when General Petraeus was in charge, and there seems to be a lot more military buy-in on the idea of talks with the Taliban. I'm just curious, since we're at a university, how many students here remember 9/11? So a lot of you. I mean, because I'm assuming that a lot of you were in elementary school. How many were in elementary school on 9/11? So 17 years, and now we have, like the next generation is coming up, and the U.S. is still at war there. President Trump has been pretty candid about his lack of patience on keeping U.S. troops there any longer, or if in fact this doesn't work out.
I don't think anybody wants to be there any longer.
Secretary Mattis has also talked about it. It's gone on long enough. But there does seem to be a really more, this time, a little bit more momentum than the past times that there have been talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. I'm curious, the one thing that the U.S. still doesn't have here is Pakistan. Can Pakistan, are they playing any kind of constructive role right now in the peace settlement with the Taliban? Can they be doing more?
They can be doing more, and we have a complicated relationship with Pakistan. Historically, they have been a supporter in the broader war on terror. You asked about 9/11. I was at the State Department on 9/11, and the very next day we had the director of the intelligence service, ISI, General Mahmoud, into the State Department, gave 6 demands. Overnight, President Musharraf agreed to the demands, and they were critical in our initial response to the 9/11 attacks and our ability to strike back and regain our footing. But going forward, they are a key party, and they have to play a role, in our view, to promoting the Taliban coming to the negotiating table. They could be doing more, and we continue to press them. They have a new civilian government. The window of opportunity is there with a new government, so hopefully we'll see a little more activity on their part to really press for that outcome.
There were some reports out of the region that President Trump sent a letter to Imran Khan, the new leader in Pakistan, this week, asking him to play a bigger role in talks with the Taliban. Can you do you know anything about that? What the U.S. is specifically asking the Pakistanis to do? Anything you can share?
I do. I don't want to get into the details of that communication, but in general, it is to use their influence with the Taliban, also to crack down on other terrorist activity where we believe Pakistan has allowed safe haven. So again, this is a new government. It's a new opportunity, window of opportunity, and we'd like a better relationship with Pakistan. Historically, we've been partners and allies in the war on terror in particular. Obviously, the president made a decision in January 2018 to suspend a lot of our assistance. Our goal at the Pentagon is to get back to a more normal relationship with Pakistan. For that to happen, we need them to help more on this problem.
You mentioned the sanctuary problem. Pakistan has been providing sanctuary to the Taliban and Haqqani network for years now. It's not really been a secret. But there is a new government, but what leverage does the U.S. actually have with the new government? Is there any, we hear about carrots and sticks, but what carrots does the U.S. have that Imran Khan and the new Pakistani government might be interested in that could bring them to helping with talks with the Taliban?
Well, presumably they would like to see some of the assistance we provided before restored. For example, in the military area, we've cut back some of the financing we were providing for training and education. The military values the relationship with the United States. It's a point of pride for a lot of the officers who are trained in our schools and trained alongside the U.S. military. The senior levels of the Pakistan military have close personal relationships with many on our side. It's not only a source of embarrassment for them that this has been suspended, they do worry about the future of their own professional force if they lack that activity with the United States. So I think there's some leverage there. I think they have recently expressed concern about the economic relationship with China, that they themselves may be falling victim to the same kind of predatory economics that others have fallen to, and they, I think, would like development assistance, investment, other types of support from other countries, to include the United States. So I think there are, your words, carrots and sticks that are out there. You know, ultimately they have to have confidence that we can be part of a process that brings about a favorable solution in Afghanistan that doesn't strategically disadvantage them. They're always concerned about India and the strategic landscape from their point of view. So we continue to work with them with respect to how we can bring that about in Afghanistan and respect their strategic interests.
Admiral Mullen, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, used to talk a lot about the Pressler babies, who were these members of the Pakistani military who grew up as young captains and lieutenants when the Pressler Amendment was enacted and there was no U.S. military to Pakistani military engagement. And it grew this generation of Pakistani military leaders who, once they got to the leadership positions, had no relations with the U.S. And it only made things worse. He always warned about exactly what you're saying.
If they were in grade school in 9/11, they probably weren't alive during the Pressler Amendment.
I'll stop geeking out for you all now. I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier some of the emerging partners and non-traditional allies. You've traveled to Vietnam 4 times this year. Why? What is it that makes Vietnam a potentially good emerging partner for the U.S.? What can each side give?
Sure. Just on the surface, the United States polls at a 92% favorable rating among the Vietnamese population.
Wow.
So we're well liked, well respected. We are doing a number of things to promote that relationship that in ways that are meaningful for Vietnam. For example, war legacy issues. They're helping us with POW, MIA issues in Vietnam, but we're helping with dioxin remediation. Agent Orange that was left behind on bases, we're paying to have that remediated. So we're doing, I think, a lot of things to regain respect and regain trust and build a relationship. The foundation is not robust in terms of a lot of activities because things were cut off after the war, but we've been rebuilding things and I think are now positioned to do something meaningful, particularly on maritime security, maritime domain awareness, which if you look at that long coast of Vietnam, they have a lot of concerns about an erosion of their sovereignty, and they have a lot of interest in cooperating with the United States. We had our first aircraft carrier visit there earlier this year. So there are a lot of interesting and exciting things happening in that relationship.
Is there another country that you're looking at as another potentially strong emerging partner in your region?
I would probably include, if you go further west, I would include India as an emerging partner. We just hosted the Minister of Defense of India yesterday at the Pentagon, Secretary Mattis. I would say Malaysia, we have some very interesting opportunities with Mahathir 2.0, the very young, spry 93-year-old Prime Minister of Malaysia. I certainly mentioned Vietnam, Indonesia is a place where we're doing more. So I'm really excited about the new partnerships that are developing and where we might be a few years from now after we make these investments.
Okay. I want to go to Q&A soon, but before we do, given the fact that we have this group of students, so I'm so thrilled to see, because it gives me just hope for future generations that you're here and you're interested in these issues. As a career civil servant, what advice would you give for them, especially some of them who might be considering a career in government?
Raise your hand and serve. I think we go through different periods in our history where our politics get a little unseemly, and Washington debate and discussion seems unpleasant and maybe even a little tawdry at times, but your service is not only worthwhile, it's desperately needed. We need good, young, smart, capable people. And raising your hand can be joining the military, it can be volunteering for service on not volunteering, hopefully paid service on Capitol Hill. It could be in our executive branch, our intelligence community. But I think, service is important and meaningful and needed. So have that frame of mind that you're open to serving the country in some capacity.
That's great. We'll take a couple of questions from students to start. Oh, that's a lot of questions.
Hi. So regarding U.S. foreign policy to China, I would like to just how would you see the long-term plan of like U.S. China U.S. relation in respect to Taiwan, and how, given that President Pence in last month talked about the possibility of having a Cold War, how do you think in the long run can the two countries avoid going into a Cold War, or is it inevitable?
Specifically about Taiwan?
Yes, regard.
Well, there's no doubt that it's a sensitive issue. The Chinese always identify it as a core interest of theirs, and they regard our activities in support of Taiwan as a violation of our One China policy. We have a very different view. We have long-standing agreements with the Chinese that define our One China policy, which preserves the space for unofficial non-diplomatic relations with Taiwan and for continuing support of their security. We, of course, have domestic law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that obliges us to do certain things, provide weapons of a defensive character for Taiwan's sufficient self-defense, to maintain our own readiness, to resist force if asked to do so by our National Command Authority. I think those are legal obligations, but really what we want to do is preserve space for the two sides to work out their differences with one another. We're not interested in promoting a particular outcome, but we want that outcome to be peaceful. We want it to be respectful of the 23 million people on Taiwan who've worked hard to establish a democracy and to have a choice about their future. We don't think that that choice should be taken away through coercion, intimidation, or through military means. It's disappointing that the Chinese cut off contact after the 2016 election. It's disappointing that they've continued to build up the military opposite Taiwan, particularly through ballistic and cruise missiles. These are not fundamental peaceful approaches, which the Chinese have committed to in their communiques with us. But there is still opportunity for the two sides to take a more diplomatic, peaceful approach. We'd like to see cross-strait talks resumed. And so we're doing what we do to support that possible process, not to promote any particular outcome. So we do value Taiwan as a partner, non-official, non-diplomatic partner, but as a democracy, as a market economy, as a place that respects religious freedom and human rights. They largely share our values in promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, and so we're going to continue to partner with them in ways that promote that. Hopefully the Chinese can see beyond their long-standing concerns to see that we're engaged in things that promote a better region, and Taiwan will be a part of that.
Thank you very much. It's been fantastic. My name is Leigh. I'm doing a PhD here in statistics, and fairly happy to hear you talk about this. So you spend a long time talking about North Korea, and in my mind, I'm always thinking about this. So from a pure Machiavellian point of view, it would be nice for China to have some issue like North Korea, which is ultimately inconsequential, but extremely distracting at some moment. And China has some ultimate control, over that issue. So I was wondering if it's possible even to seek a so-called solution of this North Korea issue without solving a much larger puzzle called China. And if we have to, if it's even better that America can coexist with this issue, North Korea issue, and even use that as some way to use it like backward towards China. To have this new dynamic between America, China, and North Korea. I was wondering if that's possible. Thank you.
Well, we see North Korea as an issue where our interests do converge with the Chinese. Not complete convergence, but I think particularly on the question of denuclearization, both of us would prefer a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. I think we both want to avoid a conflict which would be very costly and catastrophic. I think we are both supportive of diplomatic processes, and the Chinese have been supportive of our diplomacy to include the summit meeting that we've had and the possible second summit. I think we do diverge in certain aspects of the Korean issue, so it's one that I think we need to continue to work on with the Chinese. Whether or not that can sort of be a key, I'm trying to put what you said into my words, if that can be a means to develop a better relationship with China overall, I think it's complicated. We have a lot of areas where we have disagreement with the Chinese right now. Taiwan was mentioned, South China Sea, some of the activities in Southeast Asia, what we view as predatory economics. So it's hard to take one issue and say that can be a window and an opening to address the overall relationship. It would certainly help if we had success on North Korea. The other thing I would add is China's a very important player and potential partner. They're not the only ones. Our most important relationship with respect to how North Korea comes out is South Korea. A very close second is Japan. So if we come out the other side, status quo with China, but a better relationship with Japan and South Korea, I'd take that right now. Those are very important allies and relationships to us, and so we need to be very mindful of their interests as well.
Hello, thanks for the panel. I'm Mozan, third year in the college, and my friends and I are representing European Horizons, a student-led transatlantic think tank. I want to ask you if, to the end goal of denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, America should work with its partners globally. But you express concern for the core reliefs, but we've seen America pulling out of Paris climate deal. And right now we've seen America also in a more isolationist move, leaving Europeans alone in the Iran nuclear deal. And right now President Trump is favoring bilateral talks, 2 multilateral talks in Buenos Aires G20 summit. How do you think other important global partners will trust the United States as a leader in solving the Korean denuclearization problem?
Well, I think look at our sustained efforts at addressing this problem. We've been at it consistently since 1994 with a singular goal, which is basically denuclearization of the peninsula. This was not invented by this administration. This has been efforts from the Clinton administration, the agreed framework talks that resulted in the 1994 agreement, the Bush administration, and the Leap Day agreement. The Obama administration took a different approach, strategic patience, and tried to isolate North Korea. But as a country, we've been involved in trying to see a denuclearized peninsula for a long time. I think judge us by the sustained efforts. The willingness of a president to go sit down across the table from Kim Jong-un is a pretty significant thing. Ultimately, other countries are going to have to judge us as they will. But I think our track record and trying to operate in good faith toward denuclearization is pretty good. And on the defense side, I can tell you our coalition in terms of sanctions enforcement is growing. It's not receding. We have more countries involved and we have more countries contributing more. So I think this is a place where we do have good support in the international community. And look, North Korea, we talk mostly about denuclearization, but this is a global problem, right? I mean, you have an assassination taking place in Malaysia of Kim Jong-un's half-brother. You have, if you go back further, you have an assassination on half the ROK cabinet in Burma. So this is a global problem that requires global solutions, and what we see at the Department of Defense is a willingness to partner with us to try to bring this outcome about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schriver, for your talk today. I'm a third-year student in college. I was actually at your talk today earlier at the IR class. My question is more theoretical. Like, according to the realist balance of power logic, Russia should balance against China with the U.S. if China continues to rise. Do you see that ever happening, or do you think like China and Russia would balance together against the U.S.?
We have a lot of problems with Russia right now and this regime. I think look no further than the recent activities in Ukraine, but beyond that, the chemical attack in the UK, the annexation of Crimea. So we've seen a lot of malign behavior, the meddling in our own election, our own domestic politics. So this is not an atmosphere that's conducive to Russia and the United States aligning for strategic purposes right now. They certainly have historical concerns about China and perhaps concerns going forward. So maybe sometime in the future that's an opportunity, but I don't see that right now. We do hear a lot about China and Russia possibly aligning, and they've had a number of high-level summit meetings. They've had more complex and robust military exercises. So there's a number of things that suggest they're trying to have a closer relationship. I'm not convinced that they can get beyond all their historic distrust and animosities. If you look at the Belt and Road Forum, which was this great international event where everybody came to Beijing and praised Xi Jinping and the Chinese for the Belt and Road Initiative, except one leader, Vladimir Putin, who went to the microphone and talked about Russia's investments in Central Asia. Very clear that they did not like the fact that the Chinese were so heavily investing in Central Asia in their own backyard. So as much as you see the data points growing of possible convergence, I don't see that they've overcome all their distrust and historical animosities. So I think right now our national security strategy appropriately identifies both Russia and China as competitors. And that could change in the future, but that's where we are right now.
How did you see Russia invited China to be an observer at their large annual exercise a couple of months ago? Did you see that as an actual effort to bring their militaries together, or was that more of just the optics for the rest of the world to see them together?
I think both sides have at least shared aversions, if not shared interests. Neither of them particularly like our leading role in the Indo-Pacific, our forward deployed forces and our presence. And so I think they're trying to explore how they might have greater cooperation to address those shared aversions. And that's certainly a part of it. As more of a China watcher, it's interesting that the Chinese are more willing to do international military engagement, participate in exercises, because historically they were reluctant to do that for fear of showing off their weaknesses or being transparent at all. It says to me that Chinese also want to get better and improve and have a more professional military. So these are things we watch carefully.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. I'm a first year in the college. Oh, sorry. My question was just, you actually just brought it up kind of with the Belt and Road Initiative in effect to Central Asia. But I was just wondering, as you know, there's a lot that is written about the Belt and Road Initiative and about Afghanistan and Pakistan, but further up, the rest of Central Asia is oftentimes neglected. I was just curious what you saw as the future of U.S. policy in respect to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, et cetera, and also how you think that the Belt and Road Initiative and at least Uzbekistan's tentative embrace of it affects that.
Yeah, I think, let me start with what we don't want. I don't think we want a Central Asia policy that's defined exclusively by Afghanistan and our interest in access and a recreation of the Northern Access Corridor. To limit it to just that would be a mistake. I don't think we want a policy that gives away any kind of perception that we're into a new great game, great power competition. I think we need a policy that is respectful of what the Central Asian countries themselves are interested in. And I think you have to disaggregate, right? I mean, these 5 stands are different and have different states of development, different political systems. And so I think we need to be agile enough to address what those individual countries' concerns might be. The political environments are more conducive right now. Uzbekistan, although you mentioned their interest in Belt and Road. In fact, the outreach that we've received from them is much more positive in wanting to develop a closer relationship with the United States. I mean, I hope we have the bandwidth and the resources to do meaningful engagement there, because it would be a mistake to relegate them either to Chinese or Russian influence or to relegate them to a place where we only care about what they can do for us in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
After World War II, Churchill said that realist alliances based merely on opportunity were too unstable to keep the peace, that there had to be some glue of common ideas, and especially ideas of free systems versus more totalitarian systems. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was, in a way, a kind of glue like that of providing economic connections and belief in freer markets to hold an alliance together. And one could even imagine it extending to India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, so it would open up the Belt and Road or be a competitor, and even with the possibility of China joining. But Donald Trump withdrew from the TPP almost immediately. Is there some way that that could be reconstituted or rethought in the administration?
You know, the TPP, and you mentioned something from my testimony before. I was on record supporting it and mentioned that in my testimony. So I had personal views on it. But look, there are a lot of, you say Donald Trump pulled out of it. Let's remember both candidates campaigned heavily against it. Let's remember that it was started in the Bush administration, and the Obama administration had 8 years and didn't get it done. In fact, took a very cynical approach and publicly admitted they were unwilling to bring it forward at times of close proximity to elections. So there are a lot of people who can take credit for the death of TPP, I'm afraid to say. What we need is a replace. We've done a repeal, but not a replace, right? And what we've talked about now is reform of our development assistance agencies, OPIC. We've passed legislation called the BUILD Act, which gives us more latitude and more flexibility to support U.S. private sector investment in the Indo-Pacific region. I think that will ultimately be helpful. We are talking with a number of countries about bilateral trade deals that could be expanded at some point. One of the things the administration is open to is not necessarily immediately joining TPP, but what would a future TPP have to look like for us to join? There is a possible deal out there that may be persuasive to those who have been critics or reluctant to join it in its current form. So there are a number of ways we could sort of go, but I think the key point is we have to have a replacement. We have to have an alternative approach to TPP, which we've withdrawn from. TPP in the 11-country form will likely exist thanks to Prime Minister Abe. So we may have future options, again, to reshape it and make it into something that we could possibly join. But for now, I think we're focused on implementing the BUILD Act, dealing with bilateral trade relationships, and so on.
Good evening, sir. I'm Hazuma Yano. I am an MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy. I'm also an active duty captain in the U.S. Army. Sir, you mentioned one of the tenets of the Asia strategy, if you will, was the need to strengthen allies in the Indo-Pacific region. At the same time, you got in a discussion about the Pressler Amendment and the challenges that came up as a result of certain restrictions that we placed on ourselves in terms of not, for political reasons, limiting security cooperation with certain countries. As a guy who has done some security cooperation work in Asia, one of the biggest obstacles that we encountered at the ground level was the Leahy Law, and essentially the broad application of Leahy Law to blacklist entire units versus specific targeted individuals. And to give a little backdrop to those who may not be familiar, it's basically a law that prevents the U.S. government, specifically military, from cooperating or conducting joint exercises with units or personnel that have allegations or credible allegations of gross human rights violations. The problem we had was there were certain individuals and units that had a history maybe 20, 30 years ago of having engaged in some kind of human rights violation, but were still on the Leahy blacklist, even though the majority of the personnel in those units may no longer have been, they were not involved in it. So kind of tying those two together of the need to strengthen allies, yet we have some of these limitations that prevent us from working with them. Is this like a conversation that's had at the, at your level, at the level that you're at, and then just overall what your thoughts were in terms of trying to move forward on that?
Absolutely, not only at my level, but through the Secretary of Defense. Senator Leahy is, a terrific senator and an honorable guy, and I think his law has really had a overall positive impact. I mean, I think it's entirely appropriate that we base our engagement on the conduct and professionalization of the forces, and if they're involved, for example, the Burmese military right now and their involvement in the ethnic cleansing in the Rakhine state to the Rohingya people, we don't need to be doing business with them right now. But you bring up a point where what if there's a particular unit that's blacklisted and it's 20, 30 years later and we're pretty darn sure there's nobody even left in that unit who took part in the atrocities. The Leahy Amendment does allow for a remediation process, and so with certain key partners we're looking at how we take them through that remediation process. I can't sort of forecast where we're going to come out on that, but I would say it's addressed at a very senior level. We recognize the problem that you are pointing out, that we're restricted from dealing with units who are comprised of individuals who've had nothing to do with those past atrocities, and we want to help them through that remediation process to close that gap.
I'm curious, can you say where you served in Asia, that this was an issue?
So I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, Bangladesh for 6 months in 2016, and I also worked in Nepal for 10 months between 2017 and 2018. So.
Thank you for your service.
Hi, my name's Yang, third year in sociology. So regarding the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy, there are doubts about its sustainability if it is a narrow security-focused initiative. So what would be a value add for the stakeholders in this region in terms of a more robust economic element, given Trump's own action in withdrawing from TPP and the China's geoeconomics, exemplified by Belt and Road Initiative?
Let me make sure I understand the question.
So what would be the economic element in this Indo-Pacific strategy?
Sure. So
that makes it sustainable.
Yeah, not to dodge your question, but I would refer you to an event this summer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce where Secretary Pompeo, Secretary of Energy Perry, Secretary of Commerce Ross, OPEC President Washburn all laid out the economic components of our strategy. And I can't sort of summarize it neatly, but one of the things we want to focus on is how we leverage where America's comparative advantages really are. And it's primarily in the activities of our private sector and our foreign direct investment. We don't always do a very good job of branding and getting credit for what we do, but briefly, China in most countries in Asia is the largest trading partner. In virtually every country in Asia, we're the largest source of foreign direct investment. That sort of attenuates over time in terms of the attention that gets because you spend things, you build factories and build facilities and then you employ people. And over time, it sort of becomes part of the landscape rather than something you get credit for. But we, through foreign direct investment, the activities of our private sector can take, I think rightfully, a great deal of credit for the development of the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, even if we don't get much credit for it. What we did with this BUILD Act was to further empower our agencies. We took OPIC and combined it with other development assistance agencies, gave them more resources, and gave them more latitude to invest. And so I think they'll be even more active than they were in the past. We've also formed strategic partnerships with other countries who have similar development assistance agencies. For example, the Japanese and what's called JBIC, the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation. And we're looking at trilateral activities, for example, with India, the United States, and Japan, how we can take our limited resources but combine them to have more meaningful investments in some of these countries. We probably won't compete dollar for dollar with China in the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think particularly when we combine our activities with like-minded countries, there'll be significant resources, and these will be programs that are clean, transparent, reliable, and ultimately to the long-term benefit of the people in these countries, as opposed to what we see as the outcome in some cases in the Chinese investment.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rahul. I'm a PhD student in the Biological Sciences Division. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to follow up on a point that was raised earlier in the beginning about technological supremacy. So I was wondering if you could talk about the the role that technological supremacy has played in enabling the U.S. to project power in the Indo-Pacific region, and how other rising powers such as China how is their research agenda little different in terms of its focus or the kinds of ways in which they envision using new technologies different from the U.S., and how our ability to project power in the region might change if other countries also have more advanced technological capabilities.
There's a lot in that question. I think the United States has historically done a pretty good job of not only investing through agencies like DARPA, Defense Advanced Research, what does it stand for?
Gosh, I should remember that too.
But agencies such as DARPA and through other research and development efforts, but also really leveraging our private sector. I mean, innovation is mostly happening in the private sector, and we have a relatively new initiative at the Department of Defense through the creation of something called DIU.
DIU.
Now here's another one that
Defense
I know
Industrial
what it is,
something.
I know what it is. I can't remember the acronym, but it's
Pentagon will destroy you with acronyms.
Yeah, based in Silicon Valley to try to really harness a lot of the creativity and innovation in that region. Defense Innovation Unit.
That's it.
Sorry. So that's another way to try to really harness what's happening in the private sector where most of the innovation is taking place. And we're also trying to fast track acquisition through special programs. Maybe you've heard of the SCO, Strategic Capabilities Office, to be able to fast track some of this technology into our military forces. So there's a number of things we're doing, and I think historically we're pretty good at it. The Chinese generally have done it through major state-run research and development efforts that are well-resourced. They've also done it, frankly, through theft of intellectual property, theft of technology, demands of now, more recently, the demands that they make on potential investors for technology transfer. The question is, can this technology be not only identified and harvested, but really integrated in meaningful ways into power projection and war fighting? And that's something that I think we're still pretty good at, and it's something that remains to be seen if the Chinese can sort of master all that. But it is an absolutely key area of our competition with China. There's no question about it.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry.
Good evening, sir. My name is Matt. I'm a first year in the medical school here. And earlier you mentioned that China tends to be better than us at preparing for more long-term problems. So I'm wondering, how do you envision climate change affecting both the geopolitical landscape in your region and our strategy in the region?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing the effects in the Indo-Pacific region. We have, in Oceania, we have concerns about rising sea levels and affecting important partners of ours, in some cases potentially affecting some of our facilities. I'm personally interested in the future of the Marshall Islands. I adopted a daughter. We have a daughter from the Marshall Islands, but we also have a key military facility there at Kwajalein, and rising sea levels there potentially threaten that facility. So I think the immediate response from the Department of Defense has been in adaptation. Historically, we've also paid some attention to reducing the carbon footprint. We created an office for operational energy security, created in the Obama administration with the help of Congress. And so there's a number of things we're trying to do, but look, the Department of Defense spends a lot of money, burns a lot of energy, contributes a lot to climate change, and that's likely to remain a fact. So we have an eye on the impacts. We have an eye on what possible adaptation and mitigation steps are available to us. If this problem really gets much worse the way is predicted, we already have problems with migration, refugees, and particularly in Southeast Asia that would only intensify. I think it's a problem for everybody. I don't know that necessarily the Chinese are advantaged by that or the U.S. is advantaged by that. It's something, inherently an international multilateral problem that'll require international cooperation.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to say a very special thank you to Secretary Schriver for being here tonight. One thing I've definitely learned tonight is I should have stayed in college because never left, because you guys have the opportunity to have these fascinating panels and hear from people like the Secretary. So let's give him a round of applause. And I want to thank the Institute also for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really honored to be at such a wonderful, and your questions are amazing. So thank you all.